Seeing none, we'll turn this over to Chris Wagner, and he's going to give us a short discussion on Kansas Open Meetings and Open Records Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. As was said, been asked to highlight some of the relevant provisions of the Kansas Open Meetings Act and the Kansas Open Records Act, and how those acts apply to this committee. Starting off with KOMA, first of all, what is the Kansas Open Meetings Act? It's a law that requires notice and access to the meetings of a public body. You can find it in the statutes at KSA 75-4318. States generally that with some exceptions, all meetings held by state bodies and agencies must be open to the public. No binding action shall be taken by secret ballot. That includes meetings of smaller groups, boards, commissions, subcommittees, working groups. However, House Rule 4305 does exempt majority and minority party caucuses from KOMA. So what constitutes a meeting under KOMA? First, it's any gathering of a group that includes a majority of the members of that group held for the purpose of discussing the business of the group. So the first element, a gathering or assembly. Meetings can take many different forms under KOMA. They can be informal gatherings before or after committee meetings, before scheduled meetings. Meeting can take place through serial communications between person to person. If they collectively involve a majority membership of the group, share a common topic of discussion, and if any or all the participants intend to reach an agreement on an issue that will require binding action by the body. Whether serial communication constitutes a violation is very fact specific. This just means that as we kind of evolve and increasingly do electronic communications, emails, video conferences, we just have to be wary of any of those that involve a majority of the membership of this committee. A KOMA issue, for example, could arise if an email was sent out to the entire committee member accidentally hits reply all, response to the committee. So just please, when you're replying to emails that involve a majority of the group, only respond to the sender only. Second element of KOMA is, as I said, a majority of members. So this is a 17-person committee. Magic number is 9. So if you get close to those numbers, start being wary of potential KOMA violations. Finally, the third element of a KOMA meeting is gathering for the purpose of discussing the affairs of the public body. So discussion is kind of what triggers KOMA, not necessarily formal action. Chance encounters that involve a majority of members will become subject to KOMA if the conversation turns to the business of the committee. However, there are exceptions for purely procedural matters, say if you're going to be out the next day or something along those lines. But you don't want the conversation maybe to slide into, what should be on the agenda based on who will or who will not be at a meeting. So just be on the lookout for that. And like I said, it could even include informal discussions after committee meetings. So please try and refrain from those to avoid any potential violations. So finally, I guess once meeting is deemed to be, KOMA is applicable to a meeting, what are the requirements? So I said notice and access. If a group is subject to KOMA, it should make a reasonable effort to allow members of the public to attend and listen to the meetings held by the body. However, KOMA doesn't actually require that the public needs to be allowed to participate in the meeting. Notice, so notice of the date, time, and place of any meeting must be given if it's specifically requested by a person. And while the creation of agenda is not actually required under KOMA, House Rule 1302 does require agenda information be provided to the public. Finally, just a brief note on closed meetings or executive sessions. You might have heard of these. Open meeting may be closed under very specific circumstances to discuss sensitive information. There are 15 different types of statutory justification to go into a closed meeting. If those potentially were to arise in this committee, Chair will reach out to our office and we'll facilitate the proper motions and procedures that have to be taken in that instance. All right, moving on to KORA, the Kansas Open Records Act. It's KSA 45-215 through 223. It requires that public bodies adopt procedures to be followed when members of the public request access to and want copies of public records. In order to fulfill this requirement, public bodies must protect public records from damage and disorganization. Records are defined as any recorded information, regardless of form, in the possession of any public body or any officer or employee of the public body. However, public records do not actually include records made, maintained, or kept by members of the Kansas Legislature. It's more that generally records of legislative committees, once they are deemed public records, once they've been distributed to the majority of the members, that's kind of how KORA would apply. Finally, just a little bit on the enforcement. So what happens if KOMA and KORA are not followed? Members who knowingly violate the provisions of KOMA or KORA may individually be liable for a $500 civil fine. An action could be brought by a private citizen, the attorney general, or a county or district attorney. Generally, these matters could be settled out of court and usually are. Violator could be required to complete a training to become more familiar with whichever act is violated. And then just, I guess, some precedent is there's precedent for courts to overlook mere technical violations when there's a good faith effort that someone was trying to comply with the acts. So that's kind of, like I said, a brief overview of those. I'd be happy to stand for any questions, or if anything comes up along the session that you want to know more about, I'd be happy to help. So,
Any questions? I guess I'd advise when in doubt, ask Chris and try to keep it down. Quick question, if 8 of us wanted to get into a Prius and go to the KU K-State game, that's entirely okay.
Yeah, no, I think like, magic number is 9, so you're good.
Okay, so there's small technicalities to it, but we don't want to violate these in any way, and if you have any questions, get a hold of Chris. Okay. Now we get the treat of Director Owen from the Kansas Water Office.
I think that'll work now. Great. I'm Connie Owen, the Director of the Kansas Water Office. Chairman Minix, thank you for introducing me, and thank you, committee, for having me come and address you today. What I'm going to review with you, just as a little bit of an overview before we get started, is what is the Kansas Water Office, and what are the primary major issues for water facing the state. And then I'll touch a little bit on the Kansas Water Plan, which was updated and adopted this last August. And then a touch on the the Water Authority's annual report, which you also have in your materials for today. And I believe you have hard copies of my slides, so hopefully you can refer to them again later when you wish, or have any follow-up questions. So if we could get started, that would be great. As you might remember, former Chief Engineer David Barfield presented to you last week, and he explained that there are 3 primary water agencies for the state of Kansas. The Department of Health and Environment is in charge of all things water quality. They do permitting, they do enforcement. So the Water Quality Agency is the Department of Health and Environment. The Water Quantity Agency is the Division of Water Resources, which Earl Lewis, Chief Engineer, is in charge of. They're the water rights, water permitting people. Both of those agencies are permitting agencies. They have regulatory functions. They have enforcement functions. The third agency is the Kansas Water Office, which does not have permitting responsibilities or enforcement authority. Next slide, please. Would you mind? Thank you. So the Kansas Water Office was established in 1981 as the Water Planning, Policy, Coordination, and Marketing Agency for the state for all things water. So this is the agency that is charged with researching, investigating, coordinating with the other water agencies to determine the water needs of the state, identify those, and work together to come up with recommendations for what to do about those, which ultimately results in the Kansas Water Plan. Next slide, please. In short, our agency mission is, as you see on the slide, to provide Kansans with the framework, policy, and tools developed in concert with agency partners and stakeholders to manage, secure, and protect a reliable, safe, long-term statewide water supply. No small task. The purpose for the Water Office is the development, as I said, of a comprehensive Kansas Water Plan. We coordinate the water resource operations of the agencies at all levels of government. So we work with state agencies, with federal agencies, and with local entities. We are also charged with ensuring adequate quantities of good quality water to meet future needs. This overall responsibility, of course, includes the duties of the Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources and Division of Conservation, as well as the Department of Health and Environment. And we efficiently operate state-owned storage in federal reservoirs, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. Next slide, please. The Kansas Water Office has two primary programs. One is the Water Planning and Implementation Program, and the other is the Public Water Supply Program. And I'll take each piece of those in turn and hopefully not get too into the weeds, but at any time that you wish, please feel free to ask questions, raise your hand. So the first of the three water planning and implementation components. Next slide, please. The Kansas Water Authority. The Kansas Water Authority is a part of and within the Kansas Water Office. It is an advisory board. These people are not paid except for attendance at meetings, which is very minimal. There are 24 members of the Kansas Water Authority. 13 of them are voting members. What you're looking at with this map are the voting members. 11 of those 13 are appointed by the governor, and they are designated to represent particular interests regarding water. So for example, you have a representation for watershed districts. You have a representation for large municipalities, for small municipalities, for the public at large, and so on. 2 of the voting members are legislative appointees. One is appointed by the President of the Senate, and one is appointed by the Speaker of the House. As you can see, there is typically an effort to have a geographical distribution as much as possible so that there is a good representation, not just of those particular interest groups and user groups, but for the different geologies and populations throughout the state. Next slide, please. The non-voting members of the Water Authority, referred to as the ex officio members, these are the directors and leaders of the state agencies regarding water. These are the subject matter experts. So for the Water Authority to do their job, they need the information and the data and the advice and the input of all of these various different state agencies, as well as, you might notice, institutions such as the Ag Experiment Station at K-State and the Kansas Geological Survey. Next slide, please. So of those three components of our water planning and implementation program, the first one was the Water Authority. The second component is our water planning and implementation, the Water Plan Development and Implementation Program. This is a program for developing that Kansas Water Plan. By statute, it begins at the grassroots level. This map shows the different regional planning areas that we have in the state. There are 14 regional planning areas. Every one of them has its own regional advisory committee. And these committees are volunteers. They are locals. They live and breathe and know the water issues in those areas of the state. And they get together and work through facilitation with staff members from my office to identify their particular needs in their areas and to formulate recommendations for goals and action plans and for funding for requests of the state water plan funds. And those funnel up through the Kansas Water Authority. So this is, by statute, we have a grassroots network of folks out there in the neighborhood of about 140 people across the state. Next slide, please. And part of our water planning efforts, there's support that's needed, as you might imagine, with data and research and boots on the ground help. So these are some examples of how that is set up and implemented through the Water Office. We have the assessment and evaluation program where we assess water resource conditions, we get data, we study, we try to get information we need to guide decisions and priorities. Technical assistance to water users is one of our programs through the State Water Plan Fund, where the Kansas Rural Water Association, we contract with them, and they provide assistance to municipalities. So if a municipality is having an issue with their public water supply, they can call the Rural Water Association, and through this program, they can get assistance from them. We have a stream gauging program that we have in partnership with the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, and this helps to develop and maintain water resource assessment. It helps to support our reservoir operation decisions, our marketing and assurance programs, the minimum desirable stream flow protection, and drought monitoring. So keeping an eye on what's going on with our stream levels and our stream flows is critically important to a number of the operations that we have, as well as to other state agencies as well. For example, the minimum desirable stream flow is something that the Division of Water Resources regulates and administers. We also have our GIS database development. Again, we need as much good data across the state regarding water resources as possible so that we can make good decisions and good policy recommendations. Next slide, please. Of our water planning and implementation program, I mentioned three components: the Water Authority, the development and implementation of the water plan, and we also have a drought monitoring and response responsibility. The Water Office is charged with the duty of monitoring drought constantly. We have staff members that are always in communication with federal entities that provide this information, such as the U.S. Drought Monitoring Service, and we watch that closely. When there is a reason to suspect conditions are changing for good or bad, then my office is charged with activating the drought response team, which is made up of the Department of Agriculture, the KDHE, KSU, and a number of state and federal entities. We get together and cooperatively come up with a recommendation for modifications of the most recent drought monitor or drought declaration that goes to the governor. So it is ultimately the governor's decision through an executive order to issue a drought declaration. And there will be a map that I show you later, but it designates for each county in the state whether it's in watch, warning, or emergency status. And each one of those increasingly severe status designations allows the opportunity for increasing assistance for those who are struggling with the drought. Next slide, please. So now we move to the second major component of the Water Office's responsibilities, and that's our public water supply program. What you're looking at is a map of federal reservoirs in the state of Kansas. The way this program works in its most fundamental sense is the federal government, primarily the Corps of Engineers, constructed reservoirs in the state of Kansas primarily for flood control purposes, but we have contracted with the federal government for storage capacity in those reservoirs. We have a contract with them, we have to pay for that. And then, in turn, municipalities and industries contract with the water office for that water. For example, Clinton receives their water out, or I'm sorry, the city of Lawrence receives water out of Clinton Lake. So the city of Lawrence has a water marketing contract with my office, and we need to pay the federal government for the storage capacity in Clinton. For your future reference, there's a map that is similar to that in that annual report on page 12, if you're curious about the map depicting the reservoirs. Next slide, please. So these different contracts that we have, they take three different forms. One is our water marketing program. These are very long-term contracts with municipal and industrial customers. We currently have 24 of those. We also have 3 water assurance district programs for municipal and industrial users, and we have access district programs for irrigation and recreation. Next slide, please. So I reviewed the two main chunks, the two main responsibility areas for the Kansas Water Office. Now I'm going to touch on the major issues with water in Kansas. And again, former Chief Engineer Barfield touched on these as well. And you will be hearing from agencies and experts that can fill you in on these issues much more specifically than I will today, because that is their area of expertise. But I'm providing an introduction so you sort of have an overall issue of the big ticket items that we have to deal with. And they are the 4 that you see there. High Plains Aquifer declines. You've heard reference to the Ogallala Aquifer, that is within that. Reservoir sedimentation, water quality concerns, and extreme events, which at this time in our history is more drought than flood. Next slide, please. So sort of taking each of these issues in turn and doing a quick touch reference, and I think you may have seen 1 or 2 of these maps last week as well. The High Plains Aquifer, as former Chief Engineer Barfield described, the High Plains Aquifer has 3 components in Kansas. The western component is the Ogallala Aquifer. That is where we have the critical declines, where we have the situation where we are indeed mining the aquifer. The Great Bend Prairie and the Equispeds Aquifer, more central and eastern of that, have different hydrology and different recharge rates. So when we talk about our critical situation, we're talking about the Ogallala, which is the western third of the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. This map shows the change in aquifer thickness, which means how much water is there. And as it moves from yellow into orange into brown, that is where more and more and more water has been lost, where there is less water left. Next slide, please. Similarly, this map represents the estimated remaining usable life of the Ogallala Aquifer. How many years are predicted to be left of use of the aquifer? And I should mention, these two maps are created by the Kansas Geological Survey, and you will be hearing from them on Thursday. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because they're the experts on that, and you will be hearing more about that on Thursday. But these maps were created by them, and this one, I believe, has an update even since this map. But in general, what you might spot, to me, what stands out the absolute most is when you look at the dark orange, red, and brown, there's less than 50 years left. And when you look at the red and brown, there's less than 25 years left. And when I say less than this period of time remaining, that's if we don't do anything any differently than we've been doing. And we can do things differently, and I'll mention that later as well. Next slide, please. The second major issue facing our state is another water supply issue. The Ogallala's groundwater, reservoir sedimentation affects surface water. 2/3 of the population of the state of Kansas relies on water from our reservoirs. Our reservoirs are filling in with sediment as they do over time. It's not a mistake, it's not unexpected. That's how it works. When free-flowing rivers that carry sediment are stopped and held still, the sediment in them drops. So over time, the sediment fills up and replaces the capacity for storing water. The most critical one that you might see, or that is depicted in this map, is Tuttle Creek Lake. So for each one of these lines, it represents one of our reservoirs. The line represents the storage capacity that the Water Office has contracted for. The blue, the total line represents the complete capacity we've contracted for. The brown shows how much has been filled in with sediment. So when you look at the line representing Tuttle Creek Lake, it is already about half full of sediment. And this is an alarming situation from the standpoint that Tuttle Creek Lake is the workhorse of the Kansas River Basin, all of northeast Kansas. This ultimately flows into the Kansas River. This system provides water supply for all of northeast Kansas, including Manhattan, Topeka, Johnson County, Kansas City. So we need to find a way to address this, and we are working on a pilot project that I'll mention later. Next slide, please. This is a projection, just to sort of demonstrate what in 2070, again, if we don't do anything any differently, what will our reservoir sedimentation look like in 2070? And Tuttle Creek will be about 90% full of mud, full of silt that we need, that should be available for water. Now, what is the upshot of this? Obviously, as I said, the public water supply, the ability to provide water to come out of your taps and your faucets, but it also impacts flood and drought resiliency. We need to be able to have space in those reservoirs for when there are floods so that we can store some floodwaters there so they don't inundate property. We need to be able to store water in there for when there are droughts so that there is extra water that we have to provide in times of drought. The management of those reservoirs is a cooperative arrangement and constant communication between the Corps of Engineers and the Kansas Water Office. And whether it's in times of flood or times of drought, I have a staff member who's the absolute expert on this, and God bless him, he's on call 24/7, especially when there's an extreme event or when drought is getting super severe. They are managing these reservoirs in real time, all the time. Next slide, please. The next big issue that Kansas faces, and I don't say next in sequence, I'm saying this is yet another, are water quality contamination issues. And these take a couple of different forms. Again, the Department of Health and Environment is the lead agency on this. This is their wheelhouse, and they will be presenting more specific information to you. So just to give you a little bit of touch on it introduction, nitrates in groundwater is one of our serious issues that we face with water quality. The map that you're looking at shows particular areas where there are violations. It's over the safe drinking level for nitrates in these areas. And this is something that is caused from nutrient runoff. So when we can implement best management practices, then they help the soil health program and a number of programs. We can help filter the nutrients and improve the soil, and it can really help to cut down on the nitrates. However, once it's in the groundwater, it's very difficult to treat. It's very expensive to treat. And a lot of these communities have faced severe expenses. I know Pretty Prairie has had an extremely expensive situation they've had to deal with, and we are facing that throughout the state. To address these, there has been a review of the per capita cost for what communities may have to spend to create their own treatment plants, and that can vary anywhere from $1,100 per man, woman, and child to $19,000. So it's a very daunting issue, very difficult problem that we face. Next slide, please. Another water quality concern we have is primarily a surface water quality, and these are harmful algal blooms. Again, these are something that is typically a result of nutrient runoff, and these can form in water bodies anywhere across the state, as you see. They're pretty much distributed, a lot of them in the eastern, but not all of them. And they are designated and watched by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And in 2022, these were the designations that there were. There were watches, warnings, and hazards. And the more severe designations result in these water bodies being closed. So for example, people may show up wanting to go boating, wanting to go fishing, wanting to play on the beach, let their dog run in the lake, and that's not permitted when there are harmful algal bloom presence in the water. Next slide, please. Okay, of those 4 major issues, the fourth one I mentioned was vulnerability to extreme events, drought, and flooding. And right now, we have far more to be concerned about with drought than flooding. But this is all taking place within the context of climate change. So I have a couple slides here that just real quickly give evidence of what we are looking at over the past many years and the trend going forward. As you can see here, the annual temperature normals, starting at the upper left, moving across to the lower right. So it's just a lot warmer, and it's getting a lot warmer. So the trend with the annual temperatures is not encouraging. Next slide, please. And there's a trend for the annual precipitation normals. So as we see in Kansas, as you look down to the last graphic there in the lower right, Kansas is sort of in the middle of, is it going to be wetter? Is it not going to be wetter? Is it going to be drier? And what we're hearing from the forecasts is that the eastern side of the state will get either more precipitation or precipitation in different patterns. And I think we've already seen that, where instead of a seasonal long rainy season, we have very intense precipitation events that happen. But the west is predicted to be drier. So when we look at the hotter and drier picture for western Kansas, then we need to be all the more mindful of what we will be doing regarding depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the governor, after hearing from the drought response team that my agency heads, the governor will do a drought declaration by way of executive order. This is the most recent one that was issued. It was issued September 30. It will be in effect until modified or until replaced by a modification through that same collaborative process. As you can see, the emergency band is enormous, and I find it interesting that early on, southeast Kansas was one of the counties to have the most immediate drought impact. It's often thought that eastern Kansas never has a problem with drought, but in this particular instance, southeast Kansas was one of the first counties to experience severe drought. And for example, with calling in requests for livestock watering assistance and such. And when the emergency declaration is made for that county, as I mentioned, that opens the opportunity for a lot more assistance for those who need it, primarily agriculture, but not entirely. But for example, USDA programs become available, USDA assistance. On the state level, there's a partnership with the Department of Wildlife and Parks, where state fishing lake water can be made available for livestock. And we can work in concert with the federal government for emergency releases from our reservoirs. So when the reason for these declarations is to enable assistance to become available. Next slide, please. So having touched on the major water issues that we face in Kansas, I'll now move into the Kansas Water Plan. The purpose of the Kansas Water Plan, and this is set out in statute, and this is the flagship responsibility of the Kansas Water Office, is to develop and implement this plan. It is to identify all water needs across the state, quality, quantity, surface water, groundwater, and to come up with recommendations for what to do about those. So this process was implemented over the last couple of years. As I mentioned before, we have the grassroots involvement of those regional advisory committees. We have the state agencies that provide their input. We receive information from the federal agencies as well. And there is a public comment period. And this year we received a very robust set of public comments that were very thoughtful and very helpful. And my staff took a great deal of time to meaningfully incorporate probably every single one of those into the final version of the water plan. So the way the process is set out in statute is the Water Office develops the plan with all of this input I just described. The actual approval of the plan is the Kansas Water Authority, that advisory board that I mentioned before. So in August at their meeting, they reviewed the draft with all the public comments and all of this incorporated, and they approved this as the new Kansas Water Plan. This also, this time around, incorporated elements from the 50-year vision, which some of you may have heard about, that there was an enormous process of public input and agency involvement, primarily addressing water supply issues, some water quality issues, and we have had these two documents out there where there was a state water plan that was required by statute and there was an advisory 50-year vision. They were both useful and helpful and important, but now we have one that's the Kansas Water Plan. It's the one that's required by law and went through the whole process. So now we can go forward with a single guiding document for dealing with the water issues that I've reviewed with you. The plan sets out 5 basic guiding principles which track those particular issues that I just mentioned. So the conserve and extend the High Plains Aquifer, secure, protect, and restore our reservoirs, improve our state's water quality, reduce our vulnerability to extreme events, And this isn't an issue so much as a need, is increasing awareness of Kansas water resources. So anytime we have had public outreach opportunities, and we're hearing this a lot from our regional advisory committees, we're always hearing the request for more information, more education. Public wants to know more. Legislature wants to know more. Everybody wants a greater understanding, which is fantastic, and that is one of our responsibilities, and that is something we're putting a very high priority on, because in order to make good decisions about policy and water management, it's best to have as many people involved in the process as knowledgeable as possible. Next slide, please. Just touching on these a little bit. I don't want to go into the weeds too much, but what are we doing about these? I mentioned the issues. I mentioned water plan talks about them. So what are we doing about them? What are some of the recommendations, and what are some of the things that we do? When we're looking at conserving and extending the High Plains Aquifer, there are a number of different programs that are going on. The local enhanced management areas and water conservation areas that David Barfield mentioned to you before, I'm sure you will be hearing more about from Earl Lewis with the Division of Water Resources. Those are mechanisms by which local users can help design their own restrictions in a way that is workable for them. And as we were hearing, and you will hear more about, in Northwest Kansas, they're pioneering this and making it work and renewing their programs year after year. And they're finding that using a lot less water can actually be more profitable. So the LEMAs and the WCAs we're very much in favor of, and the water plan encourages more and more of those. The Water Office is also expanding what used to be known as the Water Technology Farm Program, where we had several farms, I think 14, maybe a little more across the state, that we subsidized to use new practices, cropping practices, land use practices, precision agriculture practices, and new technologies that help with management that allows for the use of a lot less water and fewer nutrients, and shows great success. So we had water tech farms that were sort of the demonstration farms that we wanted to show these things really work. We're expanding that because we know that adoption of these practices is really key. So we now have expanded it to what we call our WISE initiative, which is Water Innovation Systems and Education. So agriculture uses, municipal uses, industrial uses, we're making a major effort toward adoption and implementation. Next slide, please. Along the topic of conserving and extending the High Plains Aquifer in the Kansas Water Plan, one of the recommendations in the water plan that the Water Authority approved was the creation of a subcommittee of the Water Authority to address Ogallala Aquifer issues, primarily explore the concept of sustainability. So that committee was formed, and it met in November in Hayes. And there were policy recommendations that that committee put forth to the full Water Authority, which adopted them and accepted them as their recommended view of state policy regarding the Ogallala Aquifer. Dawn Bueller, the chair of the Water Authority, will be presenting to you in the future a little bit, and she will go into that in more detail. But those policy recommendations are included in your annual report among the first few pages, so you can read those statements. Primarily, the idea is that planned depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer, which has been the approach up until now, the Water Authority said planned depletion should no longer be the policy of the state of Kansas. It's no longer in the best interest of the state. And the Water Authority said a collaborative process should be implemented to bring together agency experts, subject matter experts, stakeholders, groundwater management districts, bring everybody around the table to figure out data-driven metrics for how are we going to manage that? What exact things do we need to look at doing? So that's where we are at this point, and that was a direct implementation of a recommendation that was in the Kansas Water Plan. Next slide, please. What to do about our reservoir sedimentation and protecting our reservoirs. There is a pilot project that, thank you to Governor Kelly and the legislature for providing enough money over a period of years that we are now able to partner with the Corps of Engineers on a water injection dredging pilot project on Tuttle Creek Lake. And this is in contrast to conventional dredging, because when there's sediment, it might seem like we'll just dredge it out of there. Well, that was done at John Redmond Reservoir at great expense, and that required the state to take out a very hefty bond that we were still paying $1 million a year on to pay off that bond. And kudos to Governor Kelly and the legislature for appropriating the money to pay off that bond. So the John Redmond Reservoir dredging bond is now paid for, and that particular project is behind us. But one thing we did learn is we can't do that. That is not a feasible response to the sedimentation of our reservoirs as an ongoing cure. And if you think about it, it's a temporary fix because it takes out the sediment, but it just is going to keep filling in. So economically, it's just not a feasible way to go about it. The Corps of Engineers recommended to the Water Office this water injection dredging idea. In its most simple sense, it's like a barge, a mechanism that travels across the water, injects water under high pressure down to the bottom, resuspends the sediment so it can more freely float out, sort of mimicking what the river would be doing if it wasn't dammed. As you can imagine, this takes a great deal of study, a great deal of engineering and planning to make sure that where it's going to take place, how it's going to be done, what is that sediment, what is the proper amount of sediment that should be flowing down, because we don't want to create problems downstream for public water intakes. We don't want to create habitat problems. So all of those studies and planning and the acquisition of the equipment is happening now. And we are hoping that this collaborative process with the Water Office and the Corps of Engineers, we're hoping that we will actually have a mechanism on the water in 2024. So if this works, if it's successful, then I think it's very promising for us going forward to help address our sediment issues. This is a technology that does work in harbors and other waterways, but it hasn't been tried in the reservoir setting yet. So we could be setting a precedent for reservoir sedimentation, not just in Kansas, but for the country and perhaps other countries. Next slide, please. Addressing our state's water quality problems, there are a number of different approaches that are being taken under the state water plan with the cooperation of various state agencies. We are involved with, for example, the Upper Ark mineralization study. That's a study that the KDHE is doing to study their uranium contamination that's happening in northwest Kansas. They're working in cooperation with Fort Hays State University. That same issue is also being addressed collaboratively between KDHE and the state of Colorado. The Water Office was also involved in attending those meetings, so hopefully we will have a cooperative way to address that problem with the state of Colorado. We're always trying to address and assess the Equisped's chloride plume situation, where old oil and gas operations resulted in basically saltwater contamination that is west of Wichita and moving toward the Wichita area. One very successful program that we have is the Milford Lake, this is a long name, the Milford Lake Water Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, where we have quite a few agencies and nonprofits and entities that work together to use best management practices upstream. So your cropping practices, what you do, where you have till and no-till, what you're growing and how you're working, and the soil health practices that you implement, that can dramatically affect the quality of the water that goes into the reservoirs, as well as slow down the sediment. So that can help with the sedimentation issues as well. Next slide, please. Reducing our vulnerability to extreme events. Again, we have a number of collaborations with partners and stakeholders and other agencies. We currently have a lower Missouri River Basin coordination study going on with 4 states, with Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. We have our Kansas River Reservoirs Flood and Sediment Study with the Corps of Engineers, which is a huge basin-wide, years-long study to help address what will we be able to do about sediment and how will we address that. We also have future basin flood planning efforts that were designated by a legislative committee. So we operate the reservoirs, as I said before, to help be ready to deal with drought and flood, but gathering the information and studying in cooperation with our partners will help us set goals and mechanisms for the future. Next slide, please. Increasing awareness. I mentioned that our education and awareness program is one of our major priorities. And again, we collaborate with partners and agencies and stakeholders. We held our governor's conference on the future of water in Kansas, which was very well attended this last November. It was wonderful to have that in person again after a couple of years of COVID. And that shares information and brings people together to network on all kinds of water issues. We have our expanding, as I said, the WISE tour, the Water Innovation Systems and Education. That's not just a program, it's going to go on the road. And so we're going to try to do 2 or 3 of these particular demonstrations and networking and information sharing tours and stops throughout the state. And we have our Kansas Runs on Water campaign, which we're trying to ramp up after a couple of years of COVID interference, where on any number of levels we're trying to help educate the public, whether it's through public meetings, whether it's through interactive programs with local schools, whether it's helping our higher institutions to develop curriculum. So we have a number of different areas that we're working in that regard. So I think you've probably heard about enough from me. I've been watching the clock. I'm known for running long, so if I've just sped through things, I apologize. I've been trying to stay on track, and I think I have, because next you'll be hearing from Matt Unruh, the Assistant Director at the Kansas Water Office, and he will be talking to you about the State Water Plan Fund and the money side of all of this. But before we turn it over to him, I wonder if anyone has any questions for me at this time. I threw a lot at you, so. Okay.
Yes. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Connie, it's good to see you. And thanks for your presentation. 2 quick questions. The first one might be better for Matt, but if the funding to retire the existing reservoir debt at Milford and Perry is approved, will there still be any outstanding reservoir debt that we're carrying?
Okay, this is moving a little bit into what Matt was going to talk about, but thanks for the question. No, last week, with the governor's budget recommendations, which we're thrilled about, the governor recommends paying down the remaining reservoir debt. So the legislature last year, and governor's recommendation, wonderful, about $80 million was appropriated to pay off 3 of our reservoirs. And that saved the state tens of millions of dollars. but that didn't pay it all off. There was approximately $53 million left remaining to pay off all the debt. Last week, the governor recommended, with the surplus that we have, paying that off now so that we will be completely debt-free regarding the reservoirs going forward. Now, when I say debt-free, when water is called into service, in other words, when there is a contract that says we want that water, then there will be operation and maintenance costs that are paid, so that will be going forward. But the current proposal would zero out our contracts for our federal reservoir supply, and it's not just great that it would save potentially up to $29 million, but it gives us control over that water. If we pay off that contract for any given reservoir with the federal government, then they have to hold that for the state of Kansas. As opposed to now, we may have a contract where we can pay for our full amount, but until we do, they can release it for flood. They can manage it for how they see fit. They can release it for barge traffic, whatever they choose to do. If we pay the remaining contract and have that completely covered, then the state of Kansas has control over that amount of water. So that's another reason to go ahead and lock that in. Does that help answer your question?
And then the other question on the Water Authority's vote about the plantation, no, understanding you don't necessarily speak directly on behalf of them and asking a little bit of an opinion. When you think about those discussions from a statewide perspective, do you anticipate that we'll need to develop new legislative tools to achieve that goal, or do you think things like LEMA's, IGUCA's, and the Chief Engineer's regulatory authority, as it exists now, is probably sufficient without new legislation?
That question is one that this collaborative process will address. I think that is a larger question than any one individual can answer at this time. But the role, and I probably thank you for the opportunity to say something I should have said at the beginning. The purpose for the Water Authority, that advisory board, their job by law is to advise the legislature and the governor and the director of the Water Office for policy, legislation, funding. That's their job. And so coming out with these policy recommendations, that is exactly what they are doing. And that, I think I would prefer to leave it for that future collaborative process. But the idea is, it was their intent to advise the legislature and the governor. And so it's possible that that may include legislative action.
Why is there no Kansas Water Authority member for the Solomon Republican District?
The Water Authority, again, the governor has 11 positions to fill. And each of those positions represents a different sort of user group, if you will. And by law, there are entities that are to recommend 3 names for those positions. So for example, for large municipal users, the League of Municipalities submits names. That's by law. So there isn't a designation that all regional planning areas will be represented. The idea is that there will be these user groups. So for example, there are conservation districts. There are conservation districts in every county in the state. There is a representative for watershed districts. There are watershed districts all over the state. So I think, without having been a part of the process designing the statute, the idea is that there will be these more comprehensive need-based groups that extend beyond each particular planning area. Does that help answer your question? No?
I understand that we have a lot of watershed districts. But I still think, I don't know why we don't have a Is there somebody that doesn't want, or you just don't want a member, or what?
Well, my office does not select the members of the Water Authority. There, as I said, by law, there are entities out there that are designated in statute to recommend to the governor whom to appoint, and it's the governor's office that appoints the Water Authority members.
Nobody's recommended, or nobody wants to take the job, or do you have any idea?
I don't have a role in that process, so to speak, so I would hate to wade into that. But point taken, comment noted.
Representative Bloom, we'll check into that and get an answer back to you. And as you speak, I hope your microphone is turned on. It is. We're not picking it up very well. For the benefit of those people that can't fit within the room, we're trying to make them totally communicated to, I guess. Any other questions?
Yes, I'm on. Bouncing off my colleague, Representative Titus, he mentioned 2 or 3 lakes. Is that just 2 or 3 of the 24 contracts that you mentioned earlier? You understand what I'm asking?
I think you're asking if there's outstanding debt on the other contracts.
Yes.
Those contracts, the 24 contracts, those are, I'm drawing a blank. I bet.
Can I help a little bit?
Yes.
I will
This is
try.
a terrible moment for me.
And those of you with better knowledge on the committee than myself, there are payments that are due to the Corps of Engineers as time goes along. And if we've been in arrears with some, there's that debt out there. And yet I believe there's some long-term contracts that are held out there in the future. Maybe Matt can help us with that.
Yes, I was going to say, I need to defer that to Matt Unruh, my Assistant Director, and I apologize that I'm just drawing a blank.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question on the governor's drought. When she declares that state of emergency, does that automatically trigger any local action to conserve, or is there anything that we need to activate on? Because I know that we're in that state of emergency, but I haven't seen anything where we need to be conserving water locally, or is it just to open up funding and assistance?
It primarily is to open up opportunities for assistance. Now, there can be mechanisms locally for conservation. For example, particular communities can have their own, but those are considered in the local control area. So there isn't mandatory conservation that's triggered by that.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Mr. Chair, I had a question.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes. Connie, I really appreciated your presentation this morning. I thought it was one of the best ones I've heard in 2 years on the Water Committee. And it simplified things for me, and I really appreciate that. I had one question about the invasive algae blooms. I assumed that was caused in some consideration by agricultural product runoff, but it looked to me like there was quite a bit of that up in our neck of the woods in the northeast part of the state. And I was just wondering, what are the basic causes for that, and how do you address that?
Well, Representative Stogsdill, thank you for your question. Yes, there is quite a bit in the Northeast. There are more water bodies in the Northeast for that to occur. And there is also a lot of agricultural activity in the Northeast. But I think to really most appropriately answer your question, it would be better presented to the Department of Health and Environment when they present.
Okay, I will ask that. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is just a quick question. I was curious what the next step is in the collaborative process for KWA. How does that move forward and how can we support?
Okay, thank you for your question. Again, this is for the Water Authority to decide what to do, but their policy statement was that there should be this collaborative process. So how that's going to be set up, how that's going to be designed, who's, you know, the design of what that will look like will be for the Water Authority itself to decide, possibly for the Ogallala Committee. But those would be good questions for Dawn, the chair of the Water Authority, when she comes. But that process has not yet been designed and put in place.
Yeah, I think we'll move forward. Thank you very much, Director Owen.
Thank you very much for having me.
And now we'll hear from Matt Unruh, the Assistant of the Kansas Water Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, members of the committee, and thank you, Director Owen, for sort of setting the stage for the next part of the discussion here when it comes to our presentation topic of today and sort of transitioning to water plan funding. So I would direct your attention, if you do have printed materials here, we would be looking at slide 29 at this point in your handout materials. And I guess I would mention too, and having a chance to hear some of the questions that would have been posed earlier too, if there is the need for any sort of additional information or clarification on anything, please feel free to touch base with myself or Connie with the Water Office. We'd be happy to provide any additional perspective or context to any of that information that might be of note. So starting out on sort of the, I guess, the water plan funding piece of this, and one of the things, and I think both former Chief Engineer Barfield's presentation and Connie's previous information really kind of set the stage for sort of the where do we go from here part of the discussion regarding, well, for one, the Water Office and our primary role, duty, responsibilities, and one of our primary statutory charges being development and coordination of implementation of the State Water Plan. So the primary mechanism for funding implementation of the water plan currently, and when we're talking about funding mechanisms, I am going to be focusing on current funding that is provided for state water plan implementation. Within the context of state water resources in Kansas, that primary mechanism is the State Water Plan Fund. So the Water Plan Fund was created in 1989, and as you can see here on your slides here, the fund is used for establishing and implementing water-related programs and projects identified within the State Water Plan. So thinking back to Connie's previous information and what she would have touched on regarding sort of the 5 guiding principles serving as sort of the foundation or general context of the water plan, what we would be looking to do to further implementation on those 5 guiding principles, as well as other, I guess, identified actions or any sort of needs identified within the water plan, would be supported within the context of state funding through the State Water Plan Fund. The Water Plan Fund itself is funded through 2 primary revenue sources, one of those being water plan related fees and the others being demand transfers. So as we're sort of going through the slides here, I'll provide some additional information and context regarding sort of the fee structure as well as the demand transfer structure. So on the fee side of things, when you think about all of the fees that are make up the State Water Plan Fund, those totals generally are in the $12 to $13 million range. And a thing of note, and you'll see this in some of the information as we sort of go through the receipts or revenue side of this, the fee structure has remained virtually unchanged since establishment, really with the exception of sort of 2 benchmarks within the overall timeline of the State Water Plan Fund. One being in 1996 when sand royalties were added in, and then again in 2008 when the Clean Drinking Water fee was added to the State Water Plan Fund. Looks like maybe the clicker is not working. I need to say next slide, that's fine too. Okay, we'll go to next slide then. And while we're waiting here, for those that do have printed materials, we would be going to slide 30 in your slide presentation. Thank you. So as far as the overall revenue or fee structure within the State Water Plan Fund, really what feeds into the Water Plan Fund would be 8 primary fees. And you see really the top part of that are the first 4 where you say 3 cents per 1,000 gallons. That really serves as the water protection fees and clean drinking water fees component of the State Water Plan Fund. So those water protection fees apply to public water supply systems, industrial use, and water used for livestock purposes. So when you see the municipal water fees, industrial water fees, stock water use, those all provide a water protection fee of 3 cents per 1,000 gallons of water that is assessed for those particular revenue sources. The other one of note would be the clean drinking water fees. And the clean drinking water fee of 3 cents per 1,000 gallons is assessed on retail water sold by a public water supply system and delivered through mains, lines, or pipes. Since July 1 of 2007, revenue from the clean drinking water fee has been distributed through the following context. A portion of that distribution, which would be 5/106ths of that clean drinking water fee, is provided to the State Water Plan Fund. The remaining revenue generated from that fee, not less than 15% of that overall revenue, is supposed to be utilized for on-site technical assistance for public water supply systems. And then the remaining balance of that is to be utilized for renovation and protection of lakes that are utilized for public water supply purposes. Another item of note in relation to the clean drinking water fee that would be prior to October 1 of 2001, public water supply systems could elect to opt out of paying this fee. And as of today, 61 public water supply systems continue to opt out of paying that fee. So a little additional context when it comes to kind of the revenue side, at least from the public water supply system, of the clean drinking water fees. As we get to the bottom part of the table here, you see the next 2 items on the chart there being the pesticide fees and fertilizer fees. So in relation to the fertilizer fees, a tonnage fee on fertilizer and a fee for registration of pesticides is assessed and transferred to the State Water Plan Fund in the following amounts, and reflected on the table that you see here as well. Fees are imposed on each ton of fertilizer sold, offered, or exposed for sale or distributed in Kansas. Of that fee, $1.40 per ton is credited to the State Water Plan Fund. Then on the pesticide fee, every agricultural chemical that is distributed, sold, or offered for sale within the state must be registered with an annual fee assessed for each registration. Law requires that $100 from each of those registrations be credited to the State Water Plan Fund. So that provides, I guess, some additional context in relation to the pesticide fees and the fertilizer fees. The last 2 that you see on the list there, pollution fines and penalties, there you see an estimate of $150,000. Really, that can vary on a year-to-year basis based off of the fines that are basically administered by the Department of Health and Environment. So on any given year, and I went back prior to the presentation today to get some additional context on this, those penalties can range anywhere from 0 within a given fiscal year up to upwards of $550,000. That's kind of the range, but if you average it out, dating back to 1991, it's generally that $150,000 range. And then again, you see the sand royalties that I mentioned would have been brought into the Water Plan Fund in 1996. You'd see that a fee of 15 cents per ton of sand sold is deposited within the State Water Plan Fund. Okay, so this is a little challenging to see both on screen and maybe in your printed materials as well. Hopefully you can see at least the general tone of the information that's included within this chart here, and there's a lot of information going on here. So I will just mention that if there's any need for additional information or clarification on any of these charts, please feel free to ask questions. We can follow up with you either here today or afterwards regarding any details of this. But one of the reasons why I wanted to include this chart within the presentation here is just to provide some context regarding the overall collection of fees for each of those sources that I would have mentioned dating back to 1991. And you can really see as far as the, I guess, those sand royalty fees and clean drinking water fees, when those would have come in, you do see where those bumps would have occurred more so on the clean drinking water fee than the sand royalty fee. So in 1996, you see the addition of the small navy blue portion of the chart that shows up that would have been basically the initiation of the sand royalties. And then in the darker red at the bottom would have been in 2008 when the clean drinking water fees would have come on board. So of note within this information too, if you're looking at the overall receipts of the State Water Plan Fund, you would see that generally dating back to 2008, really the revenues that have been generated or fees that have been paid into the Clean Drinking Water Fee Fund that add to the overall State Water Plan Fund distributions have us in the ballpark of $12 to $13 million. That's really kind of the range that's reflected within the overall fees that are collected in revenue side of the State Water Plan Fund if you're looking at the fee structure as a whole. Now, the next piece of the State Water Plan Fund would be the demand transfers that feed into the State Water Plan Fund. And those two statutory demand transfers that provide up to $8 million of funding for the State Water Plan Fund would be, first off, $2 million from the Economic Development Initiatives Fund, or EDIF, and then $6 million would be the statutory demand transfer for State General Fund. So when you see and hear information regarding the State Water Plan Fund and the demand transfers that feed into the State Water Plan Fund, those would be what are indicated when you're looking at things from an EDIF or SGF standpoint. Of note, and not reflected on this table here because this only gets us up through the most recently completed fiscal year, so FY 2022, it is of note that for current fiscal year, FY 23, that was the first time dating back to fiscal year 2008 that the full $8 million SGF EDIF demand transfer was made. So thank you, Legislature and Governor Kelly, for providing that demand transfer to the State Water Plan Fund. But one topic of discussion that really gets brought up in a lot of circles is with that $8 million SGF EDIF demand transfer being in statute and noting that it had been basically back to fiscal year 2008 would have been the last full demand transfer. What is kind of the, I guess, the balance of transfers not made over time? And you see on your slide deck here that roughly or over $84.4 million would be what that balance would be on transfers that were not made dating back to fiscal year 91. So just some additional context for you all as you're reviewing this information and for future purposes regarding that demand transfer and history of the transfer over time. So this next slide here is the overall revenues of the State Water Plan Fund when you factor in all funding sources. So talking about the 8 fees that feed into the State Water Plan Fund, as well as the 8 million SGF EDIF demand transfers and the history of those transfers over time. So just some additional context regarding the chart that you would be looking at, and for printed material reference purposes, we're looking at slide 33 here. So the dark purple that would be the second from the top would be the indication of SGF transfers over time, so you can see the variation that has played out in those transfers over time. And then further down on the chart, if you look at sort of the darker green portion of the chart there, those would be the EDIF transfers. So again, you see the history over time for those EDIF demand transfers. I will note that for your purposes and just information purposes as a whole, the governor's budget recommendations that would have been presented on last week do include the full 8 million SGF EDIF demand transfer within those recommendations. So real briefly too, and I know we're kind of running up on time, so I might start moving through this information a little more quickly here for some final questions. And again, just want to mention, for any material we don't get through today, or if there's any additional information needed, feel free to reach out to the Water Office. But I did think in relation to the overall State Water Plan Fund development process and I guess the overall process that we work through with our regional advisory committees and the Water Authority and other agencies to come up with recommendations for the State Water Plan Fund. This slide here really walks you through the process that we work through to come up to really where we're at this stage of the game regarding sort of the last two pieces of the phase. So we know that governor's budget recommendations were presented on last week, and really that sort of kickstarts the legislative process when it comes to the State Water Plan Fund. But you can see there's a great deal of information and just coordination and collaboration that takes place regarding development of those recommendations in advance of what you see here today currently. So at the beginning of that, we receive input from regional advisory committees as well as the agencies that receive State Water Plan funding. That information is coordinated with the budget committee of the Water Authority, and then with the budget committee engagement that takes place for Water Authority purposes. That information is provided to the Water Authority as a whole, and then they come up with their overall budget recommendations that they would have taken action on in September of this year. So this process from start to finish really kicks off in April and gets us to this last part of the phase. So just for time considerations, that's probably the extent of the detail I'll provide there. But again, we can follow up as needed and as requested. And again, another reference information time for you as well. Hopefully you all have printed copies of the Water Authority's annual report to the governor and legislature. Again, that is a great resource when it comes to State Water Plan Fund recommendation from a Water Authority standpoint, and how those specific funding lines within the State Water Plan Fund are utilized currently to implement the State Water Plan as a whole. So just wanted to briefly touch on, and I won't go into detail on this, but on page 6 of the annual report, you would see the Water Authority's budget recommendations that they would have taken action on back in September. So again, the far right side of the table there would be the recommendations forthcoming from the Water Authority when it comes to State Water Plan Fund expenditures. This next slide here, page 7 of the annual report, when you look at base budget considerations versus enhancement recommendations forthcoming of the Water Authority, the table here on page 7 indicates where those enhancement requests were noted from the Water Authority. And again, I'll prevent going into detail for time considerations here, but page 7 has sort of a snapshot of those enhancement recommendations that the Water Authority took action on. Page 7, again, of the annual report, and this sort of gets into the water plan coordination and implementation piece of things. There's mention of sort of the process that we worked through, and Director Owen would have mentioned this in her presentation earlier as well, just the overall 5-year update of the State Water Plan Fund, so additional information and context regarding that overall water plan update process. Which really gets us to kind of the funding need side of things. And the Water Authority, one of the things that they tasked each of the respective agencies that receive State Water Plan funding to help further information sharing when it comes to water plan implementation would be really taking a look at previous Blue Ribbon Funding Task Force budget information that would have been compiled, and we hear a lot about the $55 million that was identified as a need for Blue Ribbon Funding Task Force purposes. The Water Authority tasked the Water Office of coordinating on basically an update of those Blue Ribbon Funding Task Force recommendations when it comes to the need side of things. And this would be reflected on page 4 of your annual report. So when we're sort of transitioning from vision to state water plan implementation and the needs that have been identified for state water plan fund implementation purposes, our initial sort of best guess estimate on what the current needs for implementing the state water plan as a whole would be are in the $69 million range. So again, that would be kind of the transition of what was previously noted within Blue Ribbon Funding Task Force information, Water Authority indicating their interest in having those numbers updated, and you would see that reflected within the materials in your annual report to the Governor and Legislature from the Water Authority on page 4. So I know that was a lot of information to try to get through in pretty short order here. I do want to thank you for your time today. Before I pause for any final questions that we might have time for, I would want to mention there are several resources that I would bring to your attention regarding further information on the State Water Plan Fund or needs identified for the State Water Plan Fund. The first would be in Legislative Research put together a very good briefing paper that provides additional information and context on the State Water Plan Fund, and I believe Heather was a primary author on that as well. This was taken back several years, but if you are needing additional information on the State Water Plan Fund, that I would have discussed previously, Legislative Research does have a good briefing paper on that. If you're interested on the revenue or fees side of this, Water Office, we have a fantastic State Water Plan Fund data dashboard that we would be happy to sit down and walk any of you through regarding where fees are generated from a geographic context, as well as where expenditures take place from a geographic context as well. So if there's interest in that, and we can share the link with you on that as well. But if you are interested in kind of a live demo, we would definitely be able to provide that to you. And then again, the Water Authority's annual report to the Governor and Legislature, a lot of good information in there as well. One final closing thought on my part would be, and we'll share this in electronic format as well, a lot of the discussion today really sort of focused on the Kansas Water Plan and the coordination and needs identified within the State Water Plan. With that water plan being recently updated, we would also provide an electronic link to the water plan if you don't already have that for future reference purposes for you. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. Any questions? That was a wealth of information. I think Matt could have spent 2 hours on the funding side of it alone. I want to thank you and Connie from the Water Office for coming in today. Anything further for the committee? We are adjourned. Thank you.